And our next speaker is already waiting. Shane James is I already see that he's been made a co-host. So I believe he's ready to start presenting.
Yep, excellent. Thank you very much, Alexander. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep,
Let me
wonderful.
present you like properly. Let's give a warm welcome to Shane James. He's going to present a topic, creating impact with people analytics, lessons learned from the Australian People Analytics Survey. The stage is all yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alexander. Really appreciate it. And I'll just pull my presentation up. Okay. So thank you very much for having me come in and present. So my topic is, as you mentioned, creating organizational impact with people analytics, and this topic is to do with our Australian People Analytics Survey, which we ran earlier in the year. And I'm with Deloitte. I'll speak a little bit about where I'm from and me before we jump in to the content. But with that, so I'm based in Australia, down in the southeast corner in Melbourne, just above the little island of Tasmania. And it's home to a number of really interesting and amazing animals. We aren't in the desert down here, but everything is still dangerous. And it looks a little bit down like in that bottom left corner. So it's the second largest city in Melbourne, in Australia, which is Melbourne, behind Sydney. So for context, we're with the region. So I'm with Deloitte Australia specifically, and hence our survey is focused on Australia. Australia as a nation is about 28 million people and about 80% the size of Canada, and that is very important when you're talking about a scope of a research piece which is based on a particular region. And we have similar industries to Canada as well, being that our largest industries are banking and financial services, mining, healthcare. We also have a slightly larger education industry as well, where we have a lot of international students coming in. So very, very interesting diversity there as well. So about me, I'm a ex-practitioner. I've transitioned to Deloitte in the last year. I started my career off in HR and very quickly moved across to people analytics, and I've been in the space for almost a decade now. I moved to Deloitte 12 months ago to help build the new practice that we are building in Deloitte Australia, which is our people analytics consulting practice, alongside Greg Newman, who heads up the function. And so that's roughly 12 to 24 months old now in terms of as a dedicated practice. And we're still in a lot of ways getting going, but as a practice itself, globally, Deloitte this is nothing new to us. And we've got a number of practices all over the world, which is something that's really exciting for a smaller team and a smaller function like ours. And so before I jump into the research itself, I'm going to talk a little bit about Deloitte's perspective on people analytics and how we think about people analytics, because we have a particular viewpoint which is a certain view which is different from many in the industry, and because we've been at it for quite a while now. So we continue to have our research support the people analytics field out of the US, which is the old ex-Burson by Deloitte. Our definition is quite broad in nature, so it includes the measurement, analysis, and reporting of workforce-related data, which in some cases it is just in some definitions it is really just the advanced analytics, but we really look at the whole value chain, and that is reflected in our model and how we use it. The idea is really to get the right insight at the right time to be able to influence decisions and to be able to have impact with the people data, which is what I guess the end point and the end game is really in the field. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So we've talked a little bit about the what, but we're going to cover a little bit of the why. And this is a really interesting graph overall because it really does show, and it's from our research, our global research from a couple of years ago. There is still plenty of opportunity in the space. So 72% of organizations see people analytics as a high priority on the left side there. But as we transition all the way over to the right-hand side and look at what the executive viewpoint is from senior executives in organizations, most say that they don't have the information they need to make sound people decisions. And that's really a really big disparity there between what we say is a priority and then what is actually happening. And we see this reflected in the results of when we run these sort of surveys as well. And that I'll get into a little bit more detail of that in just a few slides. Before we look at the last part of where Deloitte views people analytics generally. So we are roughly at about our second maturity model from the previous talent analytics maturity model, which had 4 levels being around reactive, operational reporting, proactive, advanced reporting, strategic, advanced analytics, and then predictive analytics as those 4 levels. And this model is quite a bit different from that, where previously it was very focused on the level of insight and the level of your technology that you were using to be able to deliver those insights to your audience. We had a little bit of a rethink about that, and Madhura Chakrabarty's research in 2017 at Deloitte really rethought the way that we think about people analytics, both internally as well as how we deliver this information to our clients. And as a result of that, we reviewed that model to be, again, a 4-step model, but much more around different profiles of organizations, and to be able to use 7 factors that contribute to those levels of maturity. And so this research, these factors and the model, we find is a little bit more useful in terms of being able to figure out not necessarily how advanced you are and how much you're using in terms of your technology and the way you're delivering information to clients, but what are those contributing factors that come into making an organization more or less mature than another? And what are the things that potentially we've done really well in some cases, and there's some areas where we could have improvement as well. And so this is not just related to the data, not just related to the technology and the architecture, but also things like data governance and how is the organization using data. We can have a really great technical process and really great technology, but when we put our information out to users, if they're not using it and they're not interested, or they're unable to use that information for decision making, then that's really going to hold up what your impact is. And so having factors in there such as our user engagement, data culture, really gives a better viewpoint as to what happens all the way through, from not just the technology and the analysis we do, which is often great, but how does it land, and then what actually happens after we put the data across to our internal clients. And so with that, we've used this model as part of our research. We've got a methodology that we use to assess organizations. And I'll talk a little bit about why we did the research first before I jump into the results. And this is really, when I joined 12 months ago, we'd done some work. We had some offerings that were already built, and we were having global conversations with other firms within the broader global Deloitte. But when we spoke to our contacts in Australia and our community of clients, all of our people analytics leaders that we spoke to said the same thing back to us. It seemed to be a really recurrent theme, is that they felt that Australia was behind the rest of the world, that the bigger markets, such as in Europe or the US, were much further ahead. And they wanted to know, are they themselves particularly behind? There seemed to be a little bit of anxiety as to whether they themselves as an organization were behind everybody else in Australia. So we wanted to know what a mature also looked like in Australia. Is what is a high functioning people analytics team in Australia, and how does that compare to a high functioning organization in the rest of the market and globally as well. So we decided to answer these questions through a survey. Nothing like this has ever been done in Australia before at the regional level, but we're quite lucky in the global Deloitte network, as we already had a methodology that we could utilize. Some global information. This survey has been run previously with 300 organizations globally. And so we have global data, and we were also lucky enough that our friends in the Belgium practice had also run this survey 6 months before us as well, to be able to do this at a much more streamlined scale and to be able to really get some interesting results at the regional level, not just the global. And while we were doing this research as well, we also had our Deloitte India practice do the same thing as well. And so they've just released their results last week. So it's a really interesting space where we're all doing this at an interesting regional level, as well as having the global results. So we surveyed roughly 26 organizations, and I'll transition across to the results so that you can get a understanding of what they look like. So again, we've got our 4 profiles of maturity. So from level 1 being around really just our complying and reacting, very sort of getting off the ground and just getting started. Most organizations in this space are much more focused around compliance, and they're just getting started with some of their management reporting. Our building and scaling organizations, which have they're really just starting to get a more conscious journey of their people analytics function and starting to bring all that information together. That may still be decentralized, but it is very much a value chain as opposed to a really dedicated function. And as they get through those maturity levels, they start to move towards what our level 3 organizations are, where they're actually starting to get some real insight. You'll generally start to see a lot more demand focus at this level, and HR and the business starts to learn a lot more about how to use information and how it could be, how data could be used more effectively and analyzed at a deeper level. And then finally, our level 4 organizations are really at more of the cutting edge. So they're definitely much more advanced in terms of having all the right things in place roughly and all the foundations set, and they're really starting to get some value out of their information, and really are starting to do some of those more advanced use cases and things that are a little bit more exciting from an advanced research perspective, but some of the more basic things as well, like how their data governance is usually very solid. They're usually starting to collaborate with other analytics teams within the organization and really drive some more business impact as well. So with that, our results, and this actually was an initial surprise to me. Our Australian results and global results, I'll talk a little bit more about where they sit, but I would say the distribution on both sides when I joined Deloitte was a little bit more surprising. Most organizations do sit at that level 2 range, no matter where they sit, whether they're in Australia or whether they're global. And then a smaller majority in that level 3 and then level 1 range as well, and very few organizations up the top. So what that says to us is there are a large percentage of organizations and a large number that are really just at the very early stages of their maturity, and we saw no difference in our results in Australia. One thing and that I would mention as well with this is that as the results are skewed towards that less mature end, what that means is that those more advanced use cases are happening at a much lower frequency, and so a lot of organizations are sitting there still doing the basics and trying to get their foundations in place. Like, is our reporting right? Are we scaling it correctly? Do we need our data governance in order? Have we got demand, or have we got too much demand for what we can supply? And so those conversations are, among most organizations, are either not happening or they're happening at the bar of instead of at the conference table. And so with that, one thing that I would say, Australia is generally roughly about the same distribution. We have a much smaller sample size, so we could see these three numbers here down the bottom on the left. We think those could change a little bit if we continued on and got a lot more organizations involved. However, we do think that this number up the top here is a little bit more static. We don't think we would get any more organizations in this category. We believe we've got the most advanced organizations in Australia that have participated. And what that means is and that one organization that sits there being a survey of 26 was a global organization with a very large footprint in Australia. And what that tells us is that one of the things that we thought is that Australia does lack some of those large global organizations that are really investing larger budgets and really doing a lot more advanced things that are driven based on those large budgets. We find that our organizations that are more advanced are very conscious of how they spend their money. They're very conscious of how they use their resources. And so we have to have really smart alternatives, because we can't just spend really, really big budgets to be able to do really interesting and cool analysis work. We have to be very conscious of how we use that money and how the budgets do come about, and making sure that when we do a project that it comes through and that it will have impact to be able to continue on that momentum of growing and succeeding in the space. But outside of that, we do have a number of really interesting companies in that sort of mid to larger size, and there are the odd regional office here that it sits in for the Asia Pacific region, and we have a growing tech sector as well, which is we're starting to see more interesting use cases coming out in the technology sector as well. So for those wondering, have I missed the window? Have I missed the boat when it comes to people analytics? We would say absolutely not. There is still a lot of organizations, regardless of whether you're at the very advanced end in your capabilities and what you're looking at, to the organizations that are really just still getting off the ground and that are really at the very more foundational levels. And so the field is definitely growing in Australia, and I'll get a little bit more into the detail of the insights that came out of that. But our most common request is not necessarily always for advisory services, but the main thing is actually from our clients and leaders in the space asking us, do we know a person, because I'm hiring in this area, and that seems to be our big theme. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes that came out as a result of the research. We didn't just do a grading exercise to figure out where everybody sat from a maturity perspective. We also used it to inform ourselves of what the market looked like, and also feed that information back to our participants as well. So every participant also received their own customized feedback report. And we generated these really interesting insights at a population level of our respondents. And so the first one was around what some of those common challenges are, why a lot of teams are struggling and why they're not at the more advanced end, and where they felt there was the biggest problems that they had. And so we are quite honest in our viewpoints. These are the general themes. We ran it as a proper research piece that has a thematic viewpoint in every topic. And so for this one, I'm going to run through usually 4 to 5 of those topics per slide. This one around why teams are struggling. The first one is usually to do with HR's relationship with IT. As we know, our people teams and our IT functions aren't always the best of friends. And this leads to sometimes a misalignment between what technology gets brought on. Did we always get the most out of our IT that we had? And sometimes there is a misalignment between those two areas. And so that's an area that I think most organizations are still working out. Some HR functions have a fantastic relationship with IT, but it's really about whether you're partnering together and where does that sit. And so it'll help a lot when you're trying to pitch for a new tool, or you're interested in a new capability, and to be able to get that relationship of partnering together to drive impact is a big driver of success for most organizations. Secondly, most, as I mentioned, smaller market, most people analytics leaders reported that they didn't have the resources and investment. So almost all, there was maybe 3 or 4 out of the 26 that said, no, it's okay, I've got enough resources and budget to be able to do what I need to. I need to just get on and get done with building what I need to build. But the majority said that wasn't the case. They were usually a little bit under-resourced and a little bit under in terms of their technology, and so hadn't really got to the point where they had a budget allocated to be able to get one of those new tools in, or to be able to hire another resource. And so they were really held back in terms of what they could actually get done and the level of scale that they could achieve with their current stack and resources. Thirdly, the CPO expectations and the CEO interest. And while this is a topic that usually for many organizations I'm not as stressed about when I'm doing advisory work, it does have a double-edged sword to it. So the 24 of the 26 reported that they had increased expectations from their CPO and more interest from the CEO in terms of being able to use people data to influence decisions. And the reason why that is a challenge is because the demand will then increase within the organization for more data, more insights, and better insights than the previous year. And so if we have a lack of resources and we do not get it more, it's doing more with less. And being able to react to that demand was a big challenge for most teams as they moved into trying to scale or trying to do more. They really have a lot more heat on them to be able to deliver it and deliver now, as opposed to having time to be able to build what they need to be able to support the business. Fourth, the last two are really quite related. Most organizations we spoke to were in one of either of these two categories, in number 3, number 4, and number 5. First one being that the HR systems were quite dated. So what our systems of collection and systems of capture and systems of storage were generally a little bit behind, not quite as integrated. Perhaps they'd been pulled together over many, many years and were in need of some level of refresh or investment to be able to reconfigure, to put some work into actually getting our systems back in order again, so that we can integrate data sets, we can join data sets, we can look at data quality and look at how the system and the processes that come out as a result of that impact the data quality and therefore the usability of that data asset. And so that was a big challenge that many were working through. On the other side, just because you put a new system in place didn't necessarily mean that you were in a clearly better position. So many organizations were still juggling with, okay, we've implemented our new HR system. How do we actually get this to work? What are those new processes? How do I build based on that? And as they got through to that next level, particularly when we're dealing with data infrastructure, being able to deal with the size and complexity of that data that comes out of our HRIS was another big challenge. Many organizations will have at least 6 or 7 systems in place for HR. That's fairly standard. It can get it to as high as 40 in some cases, and particularly organizations with a global footprint or a lot of small regional offices. trying to get all that data to connect together and synchronize and into one spot to be able to use and model and get really interesting insights out of, or scale dashboarding, they really did struggle with that complexity. HR generally is a much more high breadth and lower volume in its data sets. So being able to join tables together to be able to have a data model that really works for your organization is always going to be the challenge. And how does all that data relate together to be able to bring that together is a challenge that many are facing at the moment. So this is a hot topics section, which I tend to say is a little bit more buzzword based in nature. It's probably one of my favorites because it has some really interesting and fun results, but it will definitely not age super well in most cases. So in terms of where we ran the survey, it was in March and April this year. So we were in that point of time coming out of COVID, I guess you would say, and returning back into offices. So move from fully remote to hybrid working. And so many organizations coming out of that period of time after going fully remote were more focused around, okay, how do I get all these people back into the office? What's the right mix and what's the right time? And how do we make sure we're collaborating well in this hybrid workplace viewpoint? And they'd found that employee listening and being able to survey and listen to employees about what their preferences were was really helpful. It had really driven a lot of insight over that time. And so many were doubling down and reinvesting in their employee listening programs to extend that. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that was done in the later section, but a lot were looking at that as a way to win through that. Secondly, around wellbeing and burnout was another challenge that faced moving into that hybrid environment. Australia is very focused just generally around employee wellness and employee health and safety. And so we do over-index a little bit on that. And so many were looking at a burnout risk of, and our employees going to transition okay and be able to be looked after and feel okay when they move back into that hybrid workplace model. Third, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This one is probably a little less buzz-based. I think this is a topic that's been around for a little while now and will continue to be. I think if we ran this again next year, it would likely pop up in that top 3 regardless. And then finally, workforce planning, which has really hit it's gone to another level in terms of demand this year. I think, I'm not sure if this is a global trend either, but Australia particularly had some issues in terms of we closed the borders during COVID, and therefore, immigration is a general fantastic tool for us from a skills perspective to be able to bring new talent, new skills, and supplement our existing workforce. And that shut off for roughly 2 years. And as a result of that, a lot of organizations were really struggling to find the skills and people that they needed. And so where previously they would be able to go and hire these new skills in and get these new people in from overseas, that talent pipeline didn't exist anymore. So really the focus moved from let's just buy in to grow to how are we going to use our existing workforce in a more effective manner. And as a result, many were turning to workforce planning to be able to achieve that. And then finally, skills and talent marketplace, again, quite linked to where the organizations sit in terms of their capabilities and skills and people available. Many were looking at this. I'd say at this point, it was much more exploration based. And so this is a topic in Australia that we would say has a little bit more of a watch and wait and see what happens, as a few organizations will go into this in a lot more detail. And so I say most of the work around skills and talent marketplace is not happening as much in Australia. We are, again, just following and seeing where that market moves for now. So moving into, I believe this is my second last topic on the research. This is really what more mature organizations were doing. So we have 8 key findings. These are our level 3s and level 4 organizations, so almost 23, almost a quarter, and that in that top side of the distribution. And so this is really focused for the rest of the organizations and what's needed in place, rather than some really inspirational advanced use cases. But what did those more mature organizations look like? What are some of the things that they did? What foundations did they have in place? And how did they move the dial to get themselves up to a more mature level? And I'll provide some examples of that. But the first one was around alignment with that data hungry CEO and CHRO. So I spoke earlier about the demand increasing and that creating problems in terms of being able to supply that information. But when you do actually meet that challenge and you get the foundations in place and are able to get all of those factors to a point where you can do that, it does have significant benefit in the case that you'll generally get a little bit more investment. There's a lot more interest amongst the organization, and generally we start to get more strategic problems come through for those teams if you are struggling to generate ideas and interests rather than having them come to you. And I have a really, really basic use case for that, which is actually reporting based from my practitioner days. I once had the CPO at the time go into an ELT presentation with the rest of the management team, and one of the executives walked past and asked, "Hey, I've just seen a employee that was laid off 12 months ago. They're still in the building, and I want to know, is that legal and is that good practice for us to be able to be doing that?" And so while this is a really basic question, my challenge would be whether your organization could solve that question to say, how often is this happening? Is it okay? And do we have the information and the data available to be able to answer that question? And so in this use case, I received an email from my boss to say, put everything to the side. Can you figure out where this person sat? And also what's the prevalence of this? Now, we have some laws in Australia that say that once you lay off an employee, there's a certain period of time that you can't re-employ them without calling into question whether it was actually a legitimate layoff or not. And so with that information, we had our data in place. We had a number of model tables that we could join together on that to be able to get that answer. And so as a result of that, we also knew what our quality of that data looked like and where we had issues in the process. So we had a certain level of governance. There's a certain amount of privacy that has to be considered in that because we're looking at it on an individual employee basis. And the other part to it is what level of speed and complexity is our data set in to be able to do this sort of analysis. And so roughly with a few matches and a viewpoint around where we sat, I was able to get an answer which is roughly between, I think it was 0.2 and 0.4% of employees that were laid off were re-employed within a couple of years, which I think there is no set date, but it's more of a general guide. And this employee, it turns out, had been laid off 4 years ago and re-employed, which is perfectly fine to do from a legal perspective as well. And so there's no single case problem. And due to our data and quality, we had a challenge in terms of what that number should be. We couldn't get a single number; we had to get a range. But either way, we had a result which is there, which signified that this wasn't a problem. And our CPO was very happy to be able to announce that in the ELT that there was no issues with our program and our practices. And that's the sort of story that we start to see with some of those more mature organizations being able to answer some of those questions from their CPO and their leadership teams. Secondly, around that relationship with IT, I mentioned this earlier, but what they did differently was really not just have that relationship, but move away from a us versus them attitude with IT, or looking at IT as a more of a technology guru and a part of the organization which is more focused around what's the best solution and what do we need, and just tell us what the answer is, but instead actually working together to figure out what are our capabilities, what do we need to be able to serve data to our customers internally, and to be able to get the right tools and work together on that. Third was around demand strategy. So many organizations with that increased demand were looking at how they can work through that, whether that's scaling, and how do we deal with these 50 requests that land in our inbox every day. If anyone's figured this out, please let me know. I am after a silver bullet on this one. But most of the time, organizations that were more mature in this space, it was because they had a plan to be able to work through that. On those more advanced projects, where most of us are more interested in, there was a strong awareness of their readiness and the complexity of their infrastructure and systems. And so being able to work through that and get that complexity understood and be able to work with it is a big challenge. And to be able to, we recommend really delivering sort of more tactical projects with a quicker ROI. And I'm aware I've only got a few minutes left, so I'll speed through these last couple of slides. Finally, some of those more mature organizations were collecting more data and figured out where they needed to do that. So for some of those organizations that were doing listening, it was around having good questions that they were asking, being able to analyze text a little bit more consciously. Asking the right questions in text to be able to get the answers that we need, and to be able to use some more interesting text analytics to analyze that. Many were also looking at office utilization as they move back into hybrid and how that works from a network perspective. And then finally, skills. Many as well had achieved better results through scale and being able to deal with their communities and audiences in a way that developed a service level for each one of those. Data governance again was used as an accelerator. So instead of it being a program which will hold you back in terms of how you run, many were using it as a way to really add value to their process. So whether that was looking at ethics, whether that was doing their privacy impact assessments up front, classifying their data, this is really seen to remove the friction from the process of doing projects rather than it being an overhead. And then finally, it was about community. And so those community aspects are very important, and it means a different thing based on which level of maturity you're sitting at as well. And so some of the more interesting use cases that we've seen, now these are pitched a little bit more at that sort of higher ROI, lower complexity in nature, with slightly varying levels of complexity. But these are some of the really interesting use cases. So the first one was around proving impact of an employee referral program, to be able to understand that if we, what impact does our referral program have on our metrics, whether that's through performance. Particularly this one was focused around turnover, and if we increase that referral program, what sort of expected outcome would we see to get? And so the big one here was around a movement in employee turnover rate. Secondly, was around a leadership development program and trying to figure out what factors does our leadership program develop, and does it actually impact anything at all? Is it worth continuing with this program, or does it not? Third was around a little bit more of an interesting, it's a little bit more optimization in nature. And so building a predictive model to be able to understand absenteeism and be able to predict it. And we found this much more for shift-based work, and to be able to understand what is our workforce strategy and how do we deal with unplanned absenteeism. And then finally, this is the big one that is the big topic from way back, is around how do we reduce attrition and understand attrition. And so this is one that is really about understanding the environment more than anything. We would say with this one, it's not just a case of go out and model it right away, such as an example like this. There are different ways to do this. You can be exploratory in nature. You can build a tool that will do a lot of that basic analysis and exploration for you. And so we would say with this one to tackle turnover with the level of complexity that you can with the time period that you've got, and to try and get better every time that you do it, because it is an ongoing problem, and you'll need to understand it in different ways at different time frames as well. So finally, I'm going to end this topic with a quick quote. This is one that I'm really excited about. It was from one of our respondents that talked about the impact of that people analytics team. And this quote was quoting their CPO, who had walked into an executive meeting and had all this data and information, such as like their CFO had, and was really excited to be able to talk about their HR topics with the data and information that they needed to be able to support those decisions and bring more information to the table as opposed to opinions. And so this is really one of those things that we really see HR getting a seat at the table on the executive team, using their data and information. And so that's something that's very exciting for us as well. So at that point, I'll end and pass it all back to you if there's no further questions. Thank you.
Jane, yeah, awesome. It's very insightful, very elaborate research, and very interesting results. And like I must notice that many things are quite different over here in Europe, and I believe in USA it's even more different. Like, for example, the post-COVID changes that you mentioned, we actually didn't have such a strict situation with COVID restrictions here in Ukraine. So people like reacted more slackly to this like restrictions, and this led to less of a like change, less of a drastic change when the restrictions were rising. But I believe there are countries in Europe that actually had even more strict COVID measures, and I might be wrong, but I guess some countries still wear masks, and yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting from an Australia perspective. We had probably the most extreme in some cases, but I'd say it's come back to much more normal now. So that the reaction to health and safety is always big in Australia, and so that's after we figured out that not everybody was going to die from this, then I think a lot more relaxation came, and as a result, we're seeing the offices and the cities really come back to life, which is great.
Indeed. And the challenges you listed, probably that you have faced this year, Ukraine, for example, had completely different challenges.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it would be a very, very different research study that would happen in the Ukraine.
Yeah.